The wind howled across the empty main street of the small frontier town, carrying with it the restless breath of dust that swirled like spirits searching for a place to settle, whispers of hunger and loss twisting through the dry air as if the land itself remembered sins too heavy to name, and at the far end of the street the gallows creaked against the pull of the breeze, its wooden frame groaning as though it, too, resisted the cruelty about to unfold before the eyes of the gathering crowd, their boots shuffling in the dirt as they pressed closer to witness another soul meet its end. And in the center of it all knelt a woman, her body bent low in the dirt, her hair tangled like dark weeds caught in a storm. Her lips cracked from thirst, chains cutting against her wrists, but even bound and broken she carried a fire in her eyes that no rope, no man, no decree could quite smother. And when she lifted her gaze toward the rancher who had stepped from the shadow of the saloon to watch, her voice was faint but steady enough to pierce through the murmurs and the spit-laced curses of the restless onlookers, and in that moment she gave him not a plea for mercy, nor a denial of guilt, but something far heavier, words that struck deeper than any bullet, words that carried the weight of despair wrapped in defiance. Just kill me fast. And as those syllables reached him, the rancher, broad-shouldered, his face marked by years of solitude, cattle drives, and losses too private to share, felt something shift deep inside him. And though he had seen men and women beg for death before, this was different. For hers was not the voice of a thief pleading for an easy end, nor a prisoner clinging to the last scraps of dignity. It was the voice of someone carrying a darkness too unspeakable to reveal, a burden that made death seem like the kindest release. And when he stepped forward, the dust cracked beneath the weight of his boots, each step echoing louder than the murmurs, until he stood before her, his shadow falling over her frail frame. And with a steady hand he reached down and pulled away. The ragged blanket draped over her shoulders, and what he saw made him stumble back. Not the lash marks he had expected, not the dried blood, or the bruises so common in these cruel lands, but something stranger, heavier, something that did not belong in this God-forsaken desert. And though he could not name it yet, he knew it was more than flesh and bone. For her body trembled not from fear, but as though she guarded a secret too, dangerous to let the world see, and the crowd leaned forward, whispers crackling like sparks waiting to ignite into fire, voices rising. "Get on with it," one man shouted, his tone eager. "She's a thief. Make an example of her," barked another, their bloodlust turning the air thick. But the rancher's eyes stayed locked on hers, his voice low, hoarse, yet steady, asking the question that weighed like lead on his tongue. "Why would you ask me to kill you?" And for a heartbeat the world seemed to stop, her lips trembling as her gaze met his, pleading, desperate, but holding something more, something unspoken, until finally she breathed words that sliced into him like a blade. "Because if they find out what I carry, it won't just be me who dies." And before he could press her for meaning, the sheriff shifted impatiently, his shotgun gleaming under the fading light as he barked, "Rancher, step aside. This ain't your business. She stole. She'll hang." But the rancher's jaw clenched, his fists tightening, and though he didn't know her name, her past, or the truth she hid, something in her eyes clawed at the emptiness inside him, stirring the remnants of a man who once had something to protect, and the crowd's restlessness grew. Shouts breaking against the tension, dust rising as boots stamped the earth, and the woman's head bowed, tears carving through the dirt on her cheeks, her whisper so soft only he could hear, "Please, don't let them see." And before he could answer, a voice cracked through the square like a rifle shot, a child's cry, shrill and raw, "Ma!" And the rancher's head turned sharply as a thin figure darted from the alley, a boy no older than 8. Ragged, desperate, his face streaked with dirt but his eyes fixed only on her, and the woman's face broke, her strength unraveling as tears burned freely, and in that instant the rancher understood. Whatever lay hidden beneath that blanket, whatever truth made her beg for death, it was no longer only hers to bear. For now, he saw the weight extended beyond her broken frame, and with the boy's cry cutting through the dust-choked air, the rancher knew that this fight, whether he wished it or not, had already begun. The dawn was breaking over the desert, but the rancher knew the silence would not last, for the hoofbeats outside carried death with them. The rancher tightened his grip on the rifle as the wooden porch creaked under his boots, his eyes locked on the outlaws gathered across the yard, men whose laughter once echoed through the night when they burned her home to ashes and left her. Family in ruin, and now silence pressed down between them, broken only by the restless snorting of horses and the distant cry of a crow. The woman behind him clutching the blanket tighter around her fragile body, her whispered plea still haunting his ears. And though fear slid into his chest like a cold knife, he pushed it down, steadying his breath as the wind carried dust across the barren ground, coating the standoff in a haze that seemed almost unreal. The lead outlaw stepped forward, his grin sharp and cruel, hand resting on the worn handle of his revolver as he called out with a mocking drawl, daring the rancher to either hand her over or die standing like a fool. And for a long moment, no one moved, the world holding its breath while the rancher felt every beat of his heart thundering like a war drum, sweat tracing lines down his temple beneath the brim of his hat. Yet he did not lower his weapon, because behind the blanket was not just a broken woman but a life he refused to surrender again. And as the outlaw shifted, the metallic glint of a revolver caught the fading light, a trigger waiting to be pulled, but the rancher's voice cut through the tension, low and steady, warning them that if they wanted her, they would have to step across his land and pay the price in blood. The wind howled harder, rattling the loose boards of the barn and lifting the tails of his coat like a flag of defiance. And though every outlaw's hand hovered near steel, none had yet dared to strike, their eyes searching his face for a crack of weakness. But all they found was a man who had already lost too much, a man carved into stone by grief and hardened by years of solitude. And as he stood his ground, the woman pressed her face into the crook of her arms, muffling a sob, knowing she had brought this storm to his doorstep. But the rancher did not falter, for in that suspended breath of time he understood something he had not before, that he was not just protecting her, he was standing against the same cruelty that once stole her life, and perhaps in fighting for her, he was finally fighting. For himself, the sun sank lower, shadows stretching long and sharp, the kind that promised night would come with violence if one wrong move was made. And still he did not lower his rifle, the barrel steady, the silence heavier than thunder, the outlaws shifting uneasily as though the earth itself resisted them. And in that frozen heartbeat the standoff had truly begun. The gang leader shifted his weight in the saddle, his voice sharp and mocking as it cut through the tense silence, calling out that the woman was theirs and daring the rancher to step aside if he valued his life, his laughter cruel and echoing against the canyon walls as his men smirked behind him, rifles loose in their hands but ready to fire at the first sign of defiance. The woman trembled beneath the thin blanket, clutching it close to her chest, her eyes wide with terror, yet holding a glimmer of desperate hope fixed on the rancher who stood tall, his jaw tight and his eyes unblinking as he measured the odds, knowing he was outnumbered but refusing to back down. For something about her fear cut through his own, igniting a quiet rage that steadied his breathing and stiffened his grip on the rifle. The gang leader taunted further, reminding him that the woman had been marked, that she had dared to defy them, and now she would be punished by their rules, his words dripping with venom as the others chuckled like vultures circling a dying animal. But the rancher did not flinch, his silence becoming its own weapon, the kind that unsettled men who lived off intimidation. And though the gang leader tried to mask it with arrogance, a flicker of unease ran through him at the sight of a man so calm, so ready to fight against hopeless odds. While the woman's breath grew shallow, every muscle in her body screaming to flee yet rooted to the spot as if the earth itself refused to let her move. Then the leader's voice hardened, demanding one last time that she be handed over or they would take her by force, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver as his men shifted, forming a loose circle with their horses snorting in the cool night air. And in that moment the rancher finally spoke, his voice low but carrying with it the weight of unshakable resolve, saying she would not be taken while he stood breathing, and the words sent a ripple of tension through the gang, their laughter dying, replaced with an uneasy silence as they realized the man before them was not bluffing, his defiance not born from recklessness, but from a strength they had not expected. A strength that forced them to reckon with the reality that the standoff was no longer just about a frightened woman, but about a man who was willing to fight them all to the bitter end. And as the woman's heart pounded, caught between dread and gratitude, the gang leader's sneer faltered, the desert suddenly colder as the balance of power shifted ever so slightly, promising a storm about to break. The rancher stood unmoving, his broad frame cutting a line between the trembling woman and the sneering men outside his gate. his voice steady, though the tension was thick enough to choke on as he declared that no one would drag her from his land. Not while he still drew breath, and the words carried with them a weight that made even the boldest among the gang falter. Though their leader quickly barked a curse to cover the moment of doubt, the woman clutched the blanket tighter around herself, her eyes wide with disbelief that anyone would risk their life for her. But the rancher didn't glance back at her, his gaze locked firmly on the men beyond the fence, his hand hovering near the worn handle of his revolver, though he made no move to draw it yet. The tension hanging like a rattlesnake coiled and waiting to strike, and the wind pressed dry dust across the silent yard, filling the space between breaths with a warning from the land itself that blood might soon soak into its soil. One of the outlaws jeered, saying no man could stand alone against a pack. But the rancher didn't waver, his chest rising slow, his stance steady. The kind of quiet defiance that belonged to men who had buried friends, fought storms, and risen again from ruin. And though his words were calm, the steel in them was sharper than any blade when he swore that his home was not a hunting ground for cowards, that this woman, broken as she appeared, would not be their trophy. The gang shifted, the sound of boots scraping gravel mixing with the restless snorts of horses, and their leader leaned forward in the saddle with a mocking grin, calling him a fool. But beneath the taunt, there was a thread of unease, because, in the rancher's eyes burned something older than fear and stronger than rage, something forged by years of hardship and loneliness, a flame that promised he would rather fall dead in the dirt than surrender a soul who had begged for mercy. The woman pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her chest shaking with silent sobs as she realized this stranger, this rugged man hardened by dust and loss, was putting his life between her and the men who had chased her like a wild animal. And though she whispered his name in desperation, begging him not to throw himself into certain death, he didn't flinch, only took one slow step forward until the wooden gate creaked beneath the weight of his stance, his eyes locked on theirs. And in that silence the night seemed to hold its breath. The cicadas hushed, the horses restless, the air trembling with the promise of violence, yet beneath it all stood a single truth, that sometimes a man who had spent his life alone found a purpose so fierce it could break the hold of fear. And in that moment, for reasons she couldn't yet understand, the rancher made it clear that she was not going to be abandoned, not tonight, not on his land, not while his heart still beat. Her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths as she clutched the rough blanket tighter, her knuckles white with fear, while the rancher stood only a few steps away, his shadow stretching across the wooden floor. But her mind was far from the dimly lit cabin. Every sound outside felt like the echo of boots that once cornered her. Every flicker of firelight twisted into the cruel sneers of men who had left her broken. And when her lips parted, the words slipped out before she could stop them. A desperate whisper trembling against the silence, begging him not to throw his life away for someone already stained by suffering, her voice cracking, as though each syllable carried the weight of nights she had tried to forget. And her eyes darted toward the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment, her fragile body shaking with the memory of rough hands and merciless laughter. And she pressed her forehead to the edge of the blanket as if it could shield her from the truth of the past, her shoulders tightening with shame she had never asked to carry, while the rancher's jaw clenched as he took in the sight of her, realizing the battle raging inside her heart was fiercer than any standoff waiting outside. Yet she spoke again, almost choking on the words, insisting that she was not worth dying for, that her scars were too deep, her sins too many, her soul already claimed by pain. And though she tried to sound strong, the tremor in her voice betrayed her, unraveling the steel she wanted to show, until finally her plea turned into a broken cry that filled the room like a wound ripped open, making his chest tighten with a fury that wasn't for her but for everything that had been done to her. And as he took one step closer, she flinched, retreating further into the folds of the blanket as if his kindness might burn her worse than cruelty ever did. And she begged him once more not to die, not to fight, not to risk the little light left in his eyes for a woman who carried nothing but shadows, her words spilling fast and uneven like rain against cracked earth. Yet even in the storm of her fear, a small part of her longed for the warmth in his gaze, the steady presence that made the walls feel less like a prison. And when her voice finally faltered into silence, the only sound left was the crackle of fire, the pounding of her heart, and the heavy breath of the man who stood unmoving, caught between the pain he had just witnessed and the unshakable resolve building inside him while she sat curled beneath the blanket, trembling, bracing herself for whatever his decision might bring, the weight of her terror pressing down like a noose tightening with each passing second. The sudden crack of the rifle split the air and slammed into the wooden walls of the ranch house, splinters flying past the rancher's face as he ducked low behind the heavy oak table, his breath ragged and shallow, heart hammering so loudly. He feared it might give him away, while outside the night seemed to hold its breath. Only the faint echo of boots crunching gravel telling him the men had surrounded the house, their shadows stretching across the moonlight like predators circling prey. And in that suffocating silence, he could feel the weight of the woman's fear pressing against his back as she crouched near the hearth, clutching the blanket tighter around herself, her wide eyes fixed on him as though begging for a miracle, while every fiber in his body screamed at him to stay down, to not rise, to not risk another shot tearing through the fragile walls. But his hands trembled over the revolver, cold steel slick with sweat, the decision clawing at him. If he waited, they would burn him out. If he moved too soon, a bullet could end them both. And still he felt the pull of duty, of something deeper than fear, a force that made him shift his weight and peek over the table, his gaze locking on the flicker of a hat brim outside the window, just enough for him to squeeze the trigger and send a flash roaring into the dark. The kick of the gun rattling through his bones as shouts erupted beyond the porch, curses slicing the silence, boots scattering, another volley answering with deafening cracks that shook the shutters and drove him flat against the floor. The room filling with smoke and dust, the smell of gunpowder sharp and choking, the woman stifling a cry as a bullet punched through the mantel, showering her with fragments. Yet she did not move, her eyes burning with silent terror, trusting him, though he was just as lost. And in that moment, as his chest rose and fell with desperate gasps, he realized there was no going back. The first shot had been fired. The war for survival had begun, and no lawman, no preacher, no neighbor would come to their aid. It was him against the faceless shadows clawing at his home, and the only thing standing between her fragile life and their merciless rage was his will to fight until either the night surrendered or his heart stopped beating. The rancher's chest heaved as the dust swirled, and the gunfire echoed off the canyon walls, each shot tearing through the heavy silence of the plains, and just when his strength began to falter against the relentless outlaws, the sound of pounding hooves rose from the ridge above, pulling every eye skyward. A lone rider burst through the curtain of sunlight, cloaked in a long coat that whipped in the wind, the glint of steel flashing at his side as his horse descended the slope like a shadow cutting through fire, and for a heartbeat, the rancher wondered if this was yet another enemy sent to finish what the gang had started. But the newcomer's rifle cracked sharp and true, dropping the nearest outlaw before he could lift his pistol, sending confusion through their ranks and forcing them to scatter behind rocks for cover. The sudden twist buying the rancher a breath he desperately needed, though suspicion burned in his mind. Who would ride into such danger for a man they had never sworn loyalty to, and why now when his fate seemed already sealed? The rider's eyes were hidden beneath the brim of a dust-worn hat, his movements precise, his aim steady. Yet there was something in the way he fought that felt personal, as if each bullet carried the weight of vengeance, and the rancher, bloodied, but unbroken, rose to his feet, clutching his revolver tighter, his instincts torn between survival and mistrust. For in this land strangers were often more dangerous than enemies you already knew. But there was no time for questions as the chaos deepened, the gang cursing and firing wildly, horses neighing in panic, the air choked with smoke and grit, and, in the middle of that storm, the rancher locked eyes for a fleeting second with the mysterious figure, a silent understanding passing between them that neither could put into words, an unspoken truce forged by the need to live through the next heartbeat. And though doubt clawed at him, the rancher fought shoulder to shoulder with this shadow from the hills, each move covering the other as if fate itself had written their paths to collide. And as another outlaw fell screaming into the dust, the rancher realized that whether this stranger was a savior or a serpent, his presence had shifted the tide of battle, turning despair into a fragile thread of hope that could snap at any moment. The gunfire had barely stopped echoing across the canyon when silence rushed in, heavy and trembling, like the air itself was holding its breath. The outlaws scattered, their pride broken and their leader lying face down in the dust while the widow clutched her children, her tears streaked with dirt but her eyes wide with disbelief at being alive. The rancher breathing hard as his rifle lowered, sweat cutting lines down his face, and the mysterious rider dismounting with steady grace, his dark coat flapping gently in the wind as he revealed himself to be an old lawman. Long thought dead, a man who had once lost his family to the same gang, and now at last found justice by standing alongside strangers who shared nothing with him but courage. In that strange way, fate had tied them all together, broken souls mending in a single night of violence and defiance, and though fear still shivered in the widow's youngest child as he clung to her dress, the rancher knelt beside him, brushing dust from his small shoulders and promising softly that no harm would come to them again. Words he had never dared to say before, but words that felt true, carved into his chest like a vow. While the rider nodded and mounted his horse again, fading back into the horizon as if he had only been a shadow called forth by their need. Never, looking back, leaving them with the gift of survival and the memory of a man who fought when the world thought he was gone. The rancher helped the widow gather her frightened children, leading them gently to his wagon, his hands no longer rough but careful, every gesture telling her she was no longer alone. And though her voice cracked when she thanked him, there was strength there, the kind born from losing everything and still daring to stand. And as dawn began to spill over the hills, gold light touching the battered town, neighbors who had hidden during the fight stepped out quietly, shame heavy in their eyes. Yet even they bowed their heads in respect, knowing that whatever judgment they had cast upon her before was washed away in the sight of her bravery and the rancher's defiance. The church bell rang not for death this time but for new beginnings, its echo softer, carrying hope instead of doom. And the children looked up at it with wonder, as if hearing it for the first time, a promise of tomorrow instead of an end. The widow took the rancher's hand, not as a woman in debt but as an equal, her heart steady now that the storm had passed, and he met her gaze with a quiet smile, the kind that spoke of more than words, of healing and perhaps love that could rise from ashes. Together, they walked forward, leaving behind the gallows that had almost stolen her life, stepping instead toward open fields where the land stretched wide and waiting, the sky endless above them, carrying not sorrow, but the simple sound of children's laughter, a sound that finally felt safe, a sound that promised their story was no longer one of despair, but of a future they would build side by side, free, unbroken, and alive. If you enjoyed this Western story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more tales of courage and heart from the old frontier. What would you have done if you stood face to face with those outlaws, fought back, or waited for a miracle rider to arrive?